I'm going to do something a bit different today. I want to cover boss mods, which I'm most known for in the Bloons modding community. I created a boss template that uses the system from Boss Rush Recharged, and you can download the template from my GitHub. I'm going to be using that in this tutorial. When you open the template project, you'll see that it has two class files, bosses and a boss handler. You shouldn't really need to touch boss handler. This has all the internal code for the template, which handles the upper UI and the boss registration system. You should only need to focus on bosses.cs. But if you're going to do something more complicated, then yeah, you may need to modify boss handler. So here I have a base boss model using create boss base. This creates a pretty basic boss using a VAD, but it changes its properties to match bosses. So this is a custom display, bronze display. This is a modded display. I explained how to do this in part 2 of my tower tutorial. Now for the boss registration system, you need to fill in a bunch of parameters. So at first it needs a balloon model, which I initialized up here. Next I need the ID. This is if you want to spawn the boss manually using like the spawn balloons command. And then you need a name for the boss, which I put bronze. Next is if it's a main boss. So in this case it's true. If this value is set to false, it's a sub boss, meaning it won't occupy the upper UI, but it will still use the boss init function, which is useful. And then the last parameter, this is the icon. You have to include an embedded resource for this to work. So in this case, the PNG with the name bronze icon is used. Now there are some optional parameters here. The next one is continue rounds. Basically this value determines how many rounds can pass while the boss is on screen. For example, if you set it to 0, then no more balloons will spawn while the boss is on screen. But if you set it to say 20, then up to 20 rounds can spawn while the boss is still on screen. So I'm going to just leave this at 0 for the moment. And then here's the description, which for now I'm going to just put nothing. You can see here the description toggle has been added to the boss. It just says nothing, and it still has a name bronze. This is the name that I type in the registration. The ID is still bronze boss. This function here, spawn on round, sets which round the boss spawns on, and you can set this to multiple rounds if you want, but probably not if you want to have later rounds have more health or different abilities. And this applies to every round set, including alternate balloon rounds. And is an optional function. By default, this will clear any other balloon spawns on the same round, so you can just have the boss alone. But if you set this parameter false, it'll still leave the other balloon spawns that round. So the easiest way to start off with adding a boss ability is to copy one that exists. Percentage. Pretty good. Start off with something simple. For the first boss, the bronze boss, I'm going to add a very simple mechanic. Now the way bosses are handled in the game is bosses have these action IDs that are stored within the trigger models. And then under certain conditions, when this activates, it'll trigger the action ID and then activate every balloon action model that has that same action ID. So in this case, I know this balloon alias also has spawn balloons. Spawn balloons action model and duplicate. to make sure this function, health percent trigger, it'll activate its action IDs when certain percentages are hit. So health dot percentage values, and then for now I'm gonna just put 0.1 f, 6 f. So for every 10% of the boss's health lost, it'll activate any action IDs that are set within health. So health dot action IDs equals spawn balloons. Now this spawn has an action ID property, and I would have to set this to spawn balloons. So every time the bronze boss loses 10% of its health, it'll activate spawn balloons action ID, and then if it has a spawn balloons action model, it'll also activate it because it has the same action ID, and I'll also have to add that to the boss as well. I can spawn the boss again. Now I just need to drain its health a bit. Let's use mad. Okay, you can see the boss just spawned a bunch of balloons. So I'll just keep damaging this. Okay, maybe not ceramics. I wanted to spawn leads instead. I'm going to alter some of these properties. I'm going to change spawn balloon type, put lead fortified. This means you have to put the balloon's ID, which you can figure out by exporting game data. So this will spawn fortified leads instead. And maybe spawn count. And it only spawns 10 at a time. What else could it change? So there are two properties: spawn track max and spawn track min. This is like how far apart the balloons can spawn along the track. You can see the boss in game again. Spawn it, and this time it's spawning leads, fortified leads, and then more spread out. A few alterations. I'll make it spawn count 30, and another thing you can do for health percentage is you can put one value, but then set its repeat first equals true. This means the boss will simply repeat the first value you put in. So 0.01. So every 0.01%. Well, I meant 1% health lost. It'll do this action. Another thing you should note is you noticed how the balloons that were spawned had that balloon area skin. So you can change the skin by changing the boss name property on the spawn. And let's say phase. No, that's not the phase. Once again, we have the boss, spawn. Okay, because I changed it to every 1% of health lost, it's going to spawn much quicker now. Okay, you see scattering tons of fortified leads all over the place. And it doesn't have a skin, because phase, if you remember the phase boss, it doesn't spawn any balloons. So Ninja Kiwi never assigned a skin to the balloons that are spawned from it. Only I think Lich and Balloon Areas has such skins. So I'm going to go on to another mechanic. Next, I'm going to use the time trigger model. This is pretty straightforward. Every set amount of time, it'll activate an action ID. And let's say every 4 seconds, don't trigger immediately, and it'll freeze. Now what I'm going to do is, you know how when you damage Vortex, sometimes it'll retreat and then it'll stun all nearby towers. So I'm actually going to take that stun aspect and apply it to the bronze boss and make it so it stuns nearby towers every 4 seconds. Now make sure the stun has an action ID that is similar to SB freeze, so that we can activate it. And stun on situation. I'm gonna just make it pretty brief, 0.5. Now there are other things you could change that. For example, this has a mutator property, which is for the stun effect. You could change the effect potentially, but I'm not gonna do that right now. So behavior time. Okay, so now the boss has both a time trigger model that triggers the freeze action ID, and it also has the stun balloons and stun towers and radius action, which has action ID of freeze. So this should get activated. In game, you can see the time trigger model in effect. Periodically, all of these towers get stunned for 0.5 seconds. So I think that wraps it up for the beginner boss. I'm going to just change this description to something more detailed. I think it's fair that a boss made of bronze has lead properties. So, balloon properties. By changing the balloon properties to lead, this means it can't take damage from sharp type, unless there's like a MIB. Properties. Next, now this line and an N, this just goes to the next line. Now let's change some of these values a bit. I'm gonna make it, yes, make the radius a bit larger, and the stun for 1 second. However, stun's a bit less often. That way it's more notable when the stun occurs. Now I spawned the boss in game, and it should be stunning in a much larger radius. However, there's a bit of a problem. The description does not fit in the box, so I'm going to need to change the size of the description box. The boss registration has properties that aren't in the initialization because they're not used as often. But there's a size Y and size X, which is basically the size of the description box. I'm just increase this to about 500, and I'm going to rename this boss to Bronze Bad. Now the reason I'm calling this boss a bronze is I'm going to do 2 more tutorials on bosses. One silver boss and one gold boss. Alright, the description's a bit better now. The name is now Bronze Bad. For the bronze boss, I just want to do the basics, such as taking vanilla boss properties and altering them, as well as assigning action IDs. The next time I'm going to be doing the silver boss, which requires using patches. By patching the health trigger and time trigger, you can do things that aren't normal behaviors. Like you can make the boss just sell people's towers, or you can make it like shoot fireballs, like in Boss Rush Recharged. And then maybe the gold one eventually. The gold one's gonna be something.